the the original content for this would have lasted about 2 hours. So I had to make some choices. So what I want to talk about is framing the problem in a certain way and the solution, and why logosynthesis is so well suited. And then I will have at least time to do a quick little case study, and then we'll see how much time there is. And definitely time for questions if there are questions after. So obviously what we're talking about is people who, for one reason or another, aren't able to do what they're used to doing. And that can be, lack of energy, lack of physical strength, diminished cognitive ability with burnout. There's a lot of brain fog and issues with memory and attention and sustained physical and mental energy. And same kinds of things in different ways with different injuries and sometimes with aging. And especially here in North America, we live in a culture which, the whole thing of anti-aging is very strong right now. And there's a lot of positives to that, which is about not subscribing to limiting definitions of what aging is or how it looks. But there's another side to that, which is that there's a whole denial of aging and a fighting against what that can mean sometimes for certain people. So, for instance, I had a 63-year-old client who was upset because his doctors said he couldn't play hockey anymore because that was his one way of relieving stress, especially body checking and playing rough. And he was starting to have heart issues. And that was his only way of dealing with stress. So that kind of limited him, and he had to work on a lot of stuff with that. So another thing that can come up with these limitations is limitations on independence and tolerance of stimuli. And a lot of it, for a lot of people, it's related to diminished ability to perform tasks, to be productive. So it's partly doing what you're used to doing, but it's also loss of identity, loss of how you see yourself and how you know yourself and how you measure yourself, how you measure your place in the world, and loss of expectations. So we all have ways that we project into the future ourselves, our lives, how our lives will go, what we expect to happen. And, this is something that logosynthesis deals very explicitly with and really informs how to work with it. And a lot of the reactions when people are struggling with these things, a lot of reactions, there's a range of reactions which can be fighting against it, denying it, trying to get back to normal, withdrawing and avoiding, shutting down, self-criticism, anger, resignation, giving up. And if you look at that list, you'll notice it looks a lot like stages of grief. And with every single person that I work with on these issues, this becomes a really great lens, a really great way to frame it and to work on it and to kind of track where they are in the process of adjusting to limitations. And when I talk about adjusting to limitations, we're not defining whether those limitations are permanent or temporary or will be resolved or not. So the goal is to accept. So yeah, going back to the grieving is a process with its own innate natural intelligence to take us from loss, from change, through all the stages of reaction to it, to a state of acceptance so that we can be in the present and move on. And so the goal is the same thing with adapting to limitations. It's accepting, it's adapting to reality. If the goal was to get back to normal, now you're creating an inner conflict between the self that you're experiencing as being and the self that you think you should be or want to be. You're creating a conflict with reality and refusing to accept reality. So there we go. And accepting reality doesn't mean accepting a different definition of yourself. It doesn't mean accepting a new narrative. It means actually rejecting value judgments, labels, definitions, expectations, and just coming back to the reality of the present moment. And in the same way, accepting yourself doesn't mean accepting a different definition of yourself or a value judgment. It just means accepting yourself. And so this is really what is at the core of a lot of the work I'm doing with people around what they're experiencing as losses and limitations. So one of the big areas of struggle is expectations. Expectations people have of themselves, expectations of that other people might have of them, and or beliefs about what other people expect of them, and things like fears of letting other people down, fears of reactions if they don't meet other people's expectations. And a lot of this comes down to what in TA is called drivers, conscious, subconscious beliefs and patterns that drive with a very fundamental purpose around being safe in the world. But when life doesn't meet those expectations and we can't meet those expectations, and this is the concept that logosynthesis really brought to me that I find so useful, is that it's really a loss of a fantasy. It's a loss of a fantasy that we had about ourselves, about life, about the way things will work out, about the way things should work. And another big piece of the struggle is around sense of self and identity. And so people who are struggling with limitations, again, physical, cognitive, energy, whatever it is, are struggling with a sense of not being themselves and of not being able to do what defined them, or the way they channeled their sense of purpose and value and productivity. And so that brings a loss of identity. And so logosynthesis, all of these things speak exactly to what logosynthesis is about, because in logosynthesis, identity is not a real thing. It's a construct. I'll go back to the other one. In logosynthesis, we are essence. And the more, and all these beliefs about ourselves and all these expectations and all these fears and these reactions are all energetic constructs that get in the way of being in harmony, in alignment, in tune with our essence. And so the goal is ultimately a feeling. So all the things we're attached to doing, the ways we see ourselves, all the things we've talked about that you can experience a loss of, if you really pursue why are we attached to these things, why do we experience them as a loss, it's because we access a certain feeling or a feeling state through these things, or we hope to or expect to access a feeling state through these things. The ultimate goal is always a feeling. And the ultimate solution is connecting with essence, because the feeling we're always looking for is the real version of that is always ultimately connection with essence, where we are in a state where we are whole, we don't need anything, we are fine as we are. So we use logosynthesis to clear these constructs, these fantasies of who we should be, how life should be or will be, constructs of identity, value judgments, and all the fears and expectations and beliefs that get in the way. And a lot of that is also narratives, the narratives we create. And that's another really essential piece of logosynthesis, which is always about getting out of the narratives, questioning the narratives, and looking at narratives as constructs too. And I find logosynthesis so powerful for helping people identify things as fantasies, as narratives, and letting go of them. So one client kind of said something one day which really framed the struggle for many people. She said, I struggle every morning because I seem to take a lot more time to be functional than I used to. I just can't do what I used to do, and I just can't do what I expect of myself, but I haven't accepted and adjusted to it yet. I keep expecting the same things of myself, and so I push myself every single day, and at the same time, I feel ashamed. So she's in this cycle, and part of this cycle is also she gets up earlier and earlier trying to get things done. So having less and less sleep, being more and more tired. And all of this comes of holding on to this expectation of what she should be able to do and who she is. So actually, before I move on, does this bring up any questions or comments at this point? Good.
No, just a confirmation.
Yeah.
I'm in the age 71, and I'm experiencing exactly that.
Mm. Yeah. And there's so much more that I want to say about this, but like I said, it would take 2 hours. So I feel like I'm rushing through a very condensed version. Um, but good, thank you. So one example I thought I could use because it's fairly quick in this case. This is a police officer I've worked with quite a bit for a long time because there's been a lot going on. There's a lot of organizational issues, toxic organizational issues that have created burnout. He's had physical injuries. And obviously, the work he does continually activates and aggravates these things, both the burnout in terms of the organizational issues and the work itself. And that burnout got, definitely worse through the pandemic. And so there's also the fact that the physical injuries he has had make him feel weak and vulnerable. Now, this affects two things. One is he is the type of man who always has been in control, wants to be in control, um, sees himself in that way, and that diminishes his sense of self. But he also feels weak and vulnerable in terms of the work he does. So he feels less safe. And like I say, that's part of his personality. He's very active. He's in control. He has high expectations of himself, and his identity is tied to everything he does. But he also has a low self-awareness, so he doesn't actually access what's really going on inside of him. So we've worked on all these different aspects with logosynthesis. What's going on in the organization, the traumatic incidents, but there's been a lot of work around self-image and identity, drivers, the patterns of behavior, the beliefs. And this belief came up when we were doing some work that doing nothing, and this ties into the session I'll just tell you about in a moment. Doing nothing equals being lazy, being a failure. And he realized, this was in the course of doing the work we were doing, this came up to the surface, and he realized he had formed that belief observing his father when he was young. A session we had recently is, on top of everything else, one day his body cam fell off and he stepped on it, slipped, and broke his foot in 5 places. And this was shortly before Christmas. And he came in so frustrated because he had had to pay somebody to put up Christmas decorations around his house. And he sees himself as husband and father and caretaker, and this is something he would do. So obviously there's a lot else going on, but this was kind of the active issue that day when he came in. And so I had him focus on this feeling of frustration. And he identified feeling weak because of all his limitations. So we did the sentences on all representations of me as weak. And then after these sentences, he was hearing in his head, I hate myself. And he was really stunned how strong that was. And again, logosynthesis is so informative here because it shines a spotlight on the fact that when you make a statement like that, there's a dissociation between I and myself. There's a separation into 2 parts. And that's such an effective way to work with these things when you tune into it that way. So we did the sentences on this representation of me as weak and broken because he identified, I asked him which part does he identify with, and he said, the I that hates myself. So we did the sentences on the representation that he has of himself. And just after the 3 sentences, it all cleared up. There was no resonance. There was no sud. There was no sense of distress or energy around feeling weak, broken, or helpless. And at that point, he totally relaxed. And at that point, he could hear that his body's message was, slow down. That's not the first time we've gotten there in our sessions, but every time we do it, cumulatively, he is slowly adjusting his old patterns and getting these things and making changes in his life. And so all of this is centered around logosynthesis principle number 1, which is suffering is primarily the result of unawareness of our essence and of our creative tasks. In other words, all these things that we suffer from as losses and limitations are beliefs and memories and projections and constructs about ourselves, about life, that interfere with our accessing who we really are, what we really are. And if that's the guiding principle, then as with all logosynthesis work, it just really simplifies the work to clearing those things and accessing more and more a sense of who you really are and that integration with wholeness. So time-wise, with the change in time schedule, I'm not quite sure where we're at.
Hi, Philippe. So you have 6 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
Do you do only logosynthesis or do you use any other form of psychotherapy or something in your sessions?
I use a very integrated approach. So I use a lot of breathing techniques. I guide people in focusing and meditation. It's everything. if we were to take it apart, I integrate a lot of different approaches in that.
And what is the point? How do you judge how to from any other method? When is the right moment to switch to logosynthesis, to use the sentences? Because I'm just starting to learn synthesis.
Yeah.
I went to the basic, but I'm Gestalt master in Gestalt psychotherapy, and for me, analyzing from another modality, and then I recognized the energy block, but I can't kind of judge the right moment to say, okay, now is the time, or this is important enough to be used as a sentence.
Right.
So if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's I think that's mostly a process of experimenting, experiencing, and discovering. Um, I've never operated in terms of using a specific method at any given time. Everything I always do is always an integration of different things. Um, although I'm sure someone looking at it on the outside would say, right now you're using this approach. But
Yeah.
um, I went through a period where I was so enthusiastic initially. I was jumping in and doing it all the time, and I had to learn that no, take your time. Um, but I think we all go through our own process of this, and it's a very, excuse me, to me, it's a very experiential thing and a very individual thing because, again, and this is also in the spirit of logosynthesis, it's about really integrating it into who we are and how we work. And I see it as something very organic. Now, after using it for 14 years, I just get this, there's part of me that will hear something and go, oh, we could do the sentences on this. And another part of me will go, slow down and just take your time, take your time. And and then sometimes, it's I realize, oh, that wasn't the right time because actually something more important is emerging. Or sometimes the process doesn't move from there and I go, oh, okay, it is the time to do this. So I've just learned through, I think it's through experience, through using it, through experimentation, you feel out what works for you. And it's also about the clients. With every client it's different. Yeah. Yes.
Philippe, thank you for this. This is a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I hope that you have an opportunity to offer the 2-hour workshop that you mentioned, because
Thank you.
I think it would kick butt. So I was wondering what your interpretation or perspective is on the concept of mission, that we're all, or the logosynthesis concept of mission, that we all have a mission that we're here to do. How does that for you tie in with what you've presented or your philosophy at all?
I actually think we have several missions on different levels. So I have, my own personal mission on the personal level in my personal life of things to do. I have a mission that's more professional in terms of place in the world. And I think I have a mission like everyone else that's related to a whole sequence of lifetimes. But so I think of that on multi levels. But the other case example that's further down this slide deck that I don't have time to present is, just yesterday, and I've been working on this for a long time because he's a very driven entrepreneur. And yet just yesterday he was saying, if I look back to where I was before, I'm really realizing now that, none of what I thought was important is important. And what's important is spending time with my family, my grandkids, and he's just talking about this whole shift. And we started having a conversation about spirit. His brother died, and we started having a conversation about he felt his brother's presence, and we were talking about. So so that working in this way of letting go of these constructs of self and of the world frees up the space to find out, who am I really? And what is important to me? Does that answer your question? Sorry, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself again. That last sentence encapsulated it perfectly. That was the answer. So I like to write it down. So it's who am I and
I don't even know what
was
it said.
Oh, well, we'll catch it on the replay and I'll write
Okay.
it down.
But it's really, you know, who am I really? What's really important to me?
That's it. Mhm.
And possibly even, what am I here for?
Yeah, that last one, that's always a sticking point for me.
Mm.
That was why I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
And with that, I'm always guiding people who are questioning that to, well, what is the thing you've been working the hardest on?
Okay.
As
Thank you.
the Dalai Lama said, if you didn't have obstacles, you wouldn't have a path.
Yes.
Yeah. I think we must probably be out of time, right, Julia?
30 seconds left.
Thank you, Philip. It was great.
You're
Great
welcome.
presentation. And I'd like to add to Adrienne, please offer the 2-hour session. I'm
Okay.
I'm a coach, not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but what you described mirrors very much the work with my clients.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I would like to hear that 2 hour also.
Thank you very much. I will.
So please do it.
Okay.
I'm closing the rooms.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye bye.